In this part, I'm going to show you the application of counterfactuals. But before we face that, I would like to say the following example would be exceptionally simple, but I hope we can get some intuition about the way of thinking of counterfactuals. Right now, we're experiencing the global warming, right? And what if I ask you to think of a counterfactual situation where the global warming doesn't happen? And I will ask you a question that how much of the likelihood would you tend to believe that people around the world would live in a cozy life? That is, people should not have experienced such a devastating, lethal global heat wave as it occurs in France 2003. How do you think of the likelihood? I think we usually tend to accept the likelihood, right? So that is what we call the probability of necessity, or PN in short. And to see the logic behind it, I think it's partially because our experience tend to tell us that most of the time it is unnecessary to worry too much about such a global warming event, about the global heat wave. Because if you look back historically, it's almost impossible that such an event, extreme weather event, would happen simultaneously. But there's only one exception. This is because the greenhouse gases emission produced by our human beings accelerated this process and making it a common threat to the nature. Okay, so that remarkable point are summarized as assigning a high value to the PN. Okay, so similarly, we have the notion of the probability of sufficiency, or PN. So uh, the story on the right hand side is that let's say if you were a person who lived in 30 years ago, and where the weather condition is pretty normal, and and again, I will ask you to think of a counterfactual condition, that the temperature around you will one day skyrocket, and I will ask you, how do you think of the probability that the sudden global warming would bring its devastating power to some of the people? I think this is about our common sense, because when global warming suddenly happen, we know that people who are in poverty, people who are in lack of shelter, those are the very people who are very vulnerable to resist in front of the climate disasters, right? So the conclusion of these two examples is that we tend to assign high value for both PN and PS. Okay, but if we look back to the sentence, and I think this might be something a bit surprisingly, and it turns out that if we have some mathematical process for the metric FAR, of course I didn't show here. It turns out that the the words very likely and over half essentially have something to do with the notion of PN and PS. That is, when I say it's very likely the probability of AR is similarly to say we got a high value of probability of necessity. There's might be one thing strange. That is, remember just now we say both PN and PS are in a high value, right? But what if they should be perfectly matched? Then then we tend to think that very likely and over half those two words are not in the same level, right? Because the later one seems to describe a weaker strength. So how could this happen? And and this is what we call when we are when we are digging into analysis. Of course, we may sometimes face insufficiency, and this is what we will introduce this in the third part. But before we go, but before we go to that, uh, I will briefly explain what is going to happen. So, whenever you see insufficiency in causal analysis, there probably hints a situation that is situation we'll consider in a more specific scenario. So how do you relate to the world specific? Let's go back to the definition of PN and PS. You see, no matter what we are considering PN and PS, we are we are talking about how to calculate the probability, right? And before we calculate the probability, we need data in the first place, right? So I say, just as I say, global warming and global heat wave. those are, such extreme weather event. Those are sort of, once in a lifetime event. Those are real events that make it hard for scientists to collect meteorological data to calculate the probability, so that the scientist would forcefully um, got a low value of PS, and the low value of a PS would somewhat dilute the effect of causal inference, of causal effect of human inference. So that's maybe the point. Okay, so for this problem, we're gonna face this problem in the third part.